I'd first of all like to get onto the away from the theory in some way into the sort of political context in which these particular riots happened, these protests happened. I noticed that we saw the killing of the US ambassador there. We didn't see the non-violent uprising of the people of Benghazi a couple of weeks later saying this doesn't represent us, and actually kicking the militants who killed the ambassador out of Benghazi, which was an amazingly positive moment, and I think far more reflective of mainstream Muslim opinion. But just before we get off this sort of theoretical discussion about God and offence, I'm sort of baffled by any moral system which says there is a God, he has existed for millennia, he has witnessed all of the wars and rapes and murders and terrible things that happen in humanity, but he's offended by something that I say to a room full of people who are laughing. That's really offensive. I just find that baffling, to be honest.
So, Kamel, can you understand what he's saying? It is kind of baffling that people would think that you're offended because he's, in some way, making entertainment in one level about God. Or
I mean, making entertainment is one thing, but why is it that making entertainment about others, other people like, or God the Almighty?
But my point is, why is God more worried about what I'm saying on stage than about like a war happening somewhere else, or people torturing his children at Guantanamo? Why is he more worried about me telling a joke?
God has created us, and the way it is one is good and one is bad. This is what the world is all about. God didn't create us
Fairly
all.
simplistic.
No, God didn't create us all to be good. There is bad and there is, and that's why that hell in heaven.
But that is, with respect, that is a framework. It's a framework within which you and your colleagues live. There are other frameworks very similar within which Christians will live, within which Buddhists will live. We each have our moral framework. I have serious concerns about legislating for morality, legislating for respect. I think that law, what it does is it prevents the worst excesses of human nature. It sets a standard below which no one will go by reference to the norms of society. But you cannot legislate for somebody's mind, the respect that they feel or don't like. I would actually take issue with what you were saying about not respecting a belief system that isn't based on evidential reality. I do respect your right to express that opinion, of course. I would not like to think that a law would require me to respect or not respect your point of view, or indeed your point of view. But I'm very interested in what Kathleen says about ethical consideration. There is a difference between law and ethics.
Yes,
and it's ethics that brings out the best in human nature.
Yeah, but you can't legislate for respect, Kamel. You can't legislate and make people respect.
Of course, you have to make that. You have to make people respect, a human being or his religious and belief. Because if you don't, then where does it end? Then what happens is that, somebody comes and start insulting me or my religious belief. And what would it be? Will I insult him back of what his ideas? And then this is the start of something else. But whereby, we look at the movie and we look at other people and how they reacted. So where do we end? There is a limit of where we can do and what we can do. And if there is no limits, then we as a human being, and in general a human being, will always continue and follow to do bad and what have you.
We need limits, Michael.
Yeah, and there are limits, and the limits are that you protect individuals from having harm done to them. You protect individuals from having their reputation damaged through defamation laws. You protect people from crimes being committed against them. But you don't protect ideas. Ideas have to be challenged, and that's how society operates. And I think it's important as well, lest it sound as if we're just picking on Islam, to recognise that in India at the moment, the president of the Indian Rationalist Association, Sonali Demaraku, who recently exposed a crying statue of Jesus as being caused by faulty plumbing and capillary action, is currently facing blasphemy charges in India, instigated by the Catholic Church in India. So the Catholic Church, while it is correctly challenging blasphemy laws, such as the law in Pakistan that a Christian woman, Abie, is facing execution for, is staying pretty silent on its own attempts to silence people who expose their supposed miracles.
Well, Kathleen, I'd be interested in your view on this, because I've spoken to Christians, born-again Christians in the last week, who value their freedom of speech above the blasphemy law, because they want to be able to express in a public forum what they believe. And if they believe, for instance, they may believe that your Mass is a blasphemy, and they want to be able to say that. Right. They might want to be able to say that his God is a false God, your God is a false God. They want to be able to say that because they believe it's true. Shouldn't they be able to say it?
Well, I think there's a difference between blasphemy, which is always directed towards God. It's an offense or an insult to God. And that's very different from defamation or insult towards a person. So because we live in a society that's made up of persons and also the groups or organizations we create, the families, the institutions that are part of society, that's where the respect needs to be. Now, I've been fortunate enough to live with atheists, to live with Muslims, to live with Hindus, to live with other Christians. And the fact that we could not just talk about our beliefs, but actually listen to each other really changed the table. And so it wasn't so much of, oh, I don't like that or I don't like this, but we could actually say, well, what do you think? And tell me about that. And I don't really get that, but explain it to me, where there's actually legitimate respect and a desire to know what the other person thinks. So getting back to what Andrea was saying, it's true that we can legislate for the common good, and we should in order to have a healthy society, but we can also demand from each other an attitude that is based on respect for your worth as a person, for the dignity of the person. And actually, I think this is actually quite relevant at the moment. In the Catholic Church, we've just started the Year of Faith, which is all about helping each person each day convert more to becoming more Christ-like. So if we begin to think about it that way, you know, what can I do today that helps me become more loving, become more forgiving, become more understanding of other people, so that I'm actually identifying with the faith that I profess to have.
Okay. Abie wants to come in there.
We're talking about respect, and I think it's important to recognise that often the major ills in society happen from having too much respect rather than too little. We had too much respect for the Catholic Church in this country, for the bankers, for politicians. In Britain, they had too much respect for Jimmy Savile and the BBC and that whole institution. So I think it's important to see that in a political context, that not having too much respect is actually quite a healthy thing, and having scepticism. I do think it's important just to place these particular riots in a political context where, particularly in Egypt and Libya where they kicked off, you have regimes toppling and you have a battle of ideas between sort of Western, secular, liberal people and, on the other hand, religious extremists. And it very much suits the agenda of the religious conservatives to try and demonise the West, to say everyone in the West hates Islam, everyone in the West mocks the Prophet. It's not that everyone in Egypt woke up one morning and opened their Danish newspapers or woke up one morning and checked YouTube and saw this movie. It's that this was spread around by people with a very specific political agenda trying to silence Western influence and up their own stance in that society.
I think there is another agenda at work as well of the extremists on the Christian side. We've got very right-wing Christian evangelicals. We've got very right-wing politicians, particularly in the US, who have their own agenda as well. And I think we need to be very, very careful. And I think we in Europe have the opportunity to create the forum for dialogue rather than being pulled towards these two extremes, which fits a global agenda.
And the guy who made that film, The Innocence of Muslims, had a very determined agenda to try and make Muslims react badly, to try and create riots, to try and make the world look and say, oh, there goes Islam again, to try and demonise all Muslims as if they are all reacting this way, when the vast majority of Muslims looked at these events in horror and went, these riots are completely over the top and shouldn't happen.
And I think, Abie, one thing that's significant about those riots is you're right, they're politically motivated and they're politically organised. It's not the case that every citizen of the Middle East suddenly magically went home and to their inexhaustible supply of Danish flags to bring out and burn when these cartoons were published. It was orchestrated and it was politically orchestrated, and it's part of a campaign internationally by the Islamic States under the aegis of the Organisation of the Islamic Cooperation to make blasphemy a crime internationally. They've been trying for the last decade at the United Nations to impose blasphemy bans around the world. They're finally starting to fail a little bit on that, and they're backing away to the idea of preventing incitement to hatred, which they describe as Islamophobia.
Okay, we might come back to that after the break, but we're going to have to take a break. Don't go away. From racism to bomb hoaxes, there are many situations where freedom of speech has been curtailed. So why doesn't God get the same protection? See you in a few minutes. You're very welcome back to Beyond Belief. We've been talking about blasphemy. And Abie, I know this might sound archaic or old-fashioned, but there is, I think, a widely held view that God is the ultimate source of law and morality, and that if you insult God, you're insulting the very foundations of law and morality. Does that argument not hold up anymore?
Well, not to someone who doesn't believe there is a God, so no is the answer. But also, like, as I said earlier, that having too much respect for traditions and institutions, everything should be up to scrutiny. Everything should be questionable. And the role I see for comedy is that we get to ask provocative questions. And and try to tell the truth. You know, a joke is only funny if it's accurate. If I describe the Pope as a cucumber, people go, what? That doesn't make any sense. Whereas if I describe him as being quite like a real-life Bond villain, they go, oh yeah, he's got the German accent, he's got the Nazi past, Price's art collection, drives a Pope mobile, owns his own country, and he's the head of a secret organisation which is trying to take over the world. And his name is Joseph Ratzinger. You can almost hear Sean Connery going, you'll never get away with this, Ratzinger. And that's funny, because it kind of catches a truth about the Pope.
To some people it's funny.
To some people it's... Well,
some people might find that offensive.
They might, and I've told that joke to a lot of audiences, and generally laughter is the response. But then again, when people come to see me, know that's what they want. But my point would be that comedy is about getting to the truth, and it's about exposing those in power who are potentially abusing that power. And that's what I tried to do in Pakistan with the show about Jesus in Guantanamo. And by the way, the Muslim audience were very receptive to it, and extremely... all the jokes which were about Jesus saying, how do the fundamentalists go from love each other to let's, you know, torture people, they went, we have this problem as well with Islamic extremists. And they found it quite funny, and they were...
Kathleen, I think...
So,
sorry, but I do think that there is a widely held view that if you insult God, you're insulting the very foundations of morality and law. I do think a lot of people feel that.
Well, I mean, obviously God is important to many people in their life, and I don't think we can disregard that. At the same time, I think we can each recognize that for law to function in society, we have to be reflecting something that is real, that is legitimate, that is founded on something that is true, that's out there. And for all of us, whether or not you believe in God, there is a sense and a reality that within each of us we have a conscience, and that conscience helps us to discern what is good for society, what's not good for society, what's good for ourselves, what's not good for ourselves. So, you know, obviously some people are offended when you insult God, because naturally he's sort of the #1 person in their life. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we just disregard any law if it's not kind of divine. You know, that each of us does have a conscience, which means we can come to know what is true and what is good.
What's the situation in the States? They don't have blasphemy law. Church-state, there's no church-state relations in that.
There's no blasphemy law as such. There's a few states that do have one on the books, but it's not applied in any way. And actually, it's pretty similar to Ireland. The whole thing of blasphemy isn't seen as important as respect for the rights of persons. So defamation, incitement to hatred, anything that would go against public order, that's pretty similar to Ireland in that sense that society is made up of persons, and so that's where we need to be respecting people and demanding respect from others as well.
But freedom of speech would probably have the ultimate value, has an ultimate, the most important
value. Well,
value.
I mean, freedom of speech is limited in the same way that you can't go and shout fire in a crowded theater, nor can you incite somebody to hatred or violence or crime. So it's not that free speech is not an absolute in America. So, and I think that's actually healthy pluralism, is when we can say certainly there are rights, certainly there are duties to each other, but at the same time we have to respect that there's different understandings about truth, that we have to respect that there's different ways of manifesting that belief, but we will respect each other's way to exhibit that and to live one's conscience well. And so I think we don't want to be a theocracy, nor do we want to be a one world.
I mean, you had a situation in the States where Pastor Jones was threatening to burn the Quran in public, and yet that value and that was held up as sacred. You do not interfere with that value.
Well, actually, what
happened... He has the freedom to do that, to express what he believes to be true.
Yeah, what happened with Pastor Jones is he claimed, this is my freedom of speech. At the same time, the president, the Secretary of State, everybody was calling him and saying, don't do this. So while there is respect, okay, there is this right, that's what I was saying before, that we need to rise above just pure legalism. It's not just, I have this right, therefore I'm going to do it, but we need to actually think, is this helpful for promoting peace and justice in the world? And even if my right says it's okay, I can actually limit myself. I mean, that's a pretty profound idea, that we don't have to wait for the state or the government to say don't do that, for us to say to ourselves, actually, you know what, I can place limits on myself in order to promote the peace and the justice and the respect of other people.
Yeah, can I go on? Do you want to...
The limits of tolerance under US law are, I think, wider than our own. You can actually go very further than you could probably go here, even in terms of bordering on incitement to hatred in the US than you can here. But I thought it was very interesting that, you know, Obama was saying that he's the president of the US and he couldn't interfere with the right of those who put up that rubbish, tawdry video up on Google.
In the interest of freedom of speech.
In the interest of freedom of speech.